You know, Scott, before we get going.
No, we be on the lookout because there will be an announcement soon about our holiday party, and it's going to be a twofer. Not only do we get to enjoy a holiday party and hopefully be able to see some of you in person, but also christen the newly renovated Tocqueville room, which is just about there with some exciting new technology that's going to make, you know, hybrid, of course, events a little bit more seamless, but also is going to be wonderful when we start to come back in person that much more in the spring. So be on the lookout for that. David's working on it right now.
Okay, and I am in that room testing out the technology. So if you lose me, then keep moving forth. You all know how the colloquium goes. Just one other thing, on December 6th, next Monday, Nathan Cook from the O'Neill School at IUPUI will be given the last colloquium of the semester. So that'll be the final one on December 6th. So please join in next week if you have the opportunity. So without further ado, I just want to introduce Dr. Angela Babb. She's an assistant research scientist here at the Ostrom Workshop and with our Sustainable Food System Science group. She's also the director of the Critical Food Studies Lab, which is part of the IU Food Institute. So Dr. Babb is all things food and has been for a long time. She earned her PhD in the geography department here at IU and joined Sustainable Food System Science shortly after. She's a critical food geographer, and her work examines the political economy of hunger and contemporary food movements. But I would say one of the what she's known best for is all of her good mathematical work and looking at the Thrifty Food Plan, which is the calculation that goes into developing SNAP benefits and looking at how that dictates people what people are able to acquire and try to do a nutritional and balanced diet, or not actually being able to based on SNAP. So welcome, Dr. Babb, to the Ostrom Workshop Colloquium. Looking forward to learning more today about geographic indicators and of sustainable food systems. So I know you're going to go in with about 10 minute sort of introduction to this, and then we'll switch over to the discussion, and I'll be looking for cues in the sidelines of people with questions. And I know I have a handful as well. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Babb.
All right, thank you, Dr. Farmer. And thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate you showing up the Monday after break, getting back to it right away. I appreciate your time here today. So I just want to make a few comments, probably no more than 10 minutes, and then I'd love to open it up for discussion. I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments. As Dr. Farmer mentioned, this is not my specialty area. I do a lot more work on SNAP, so kind of new to this area of research, and really appreciate all the feedback I can get. So let's see. So I wanted to give a little bit of context about why Stacy, Kate, and Ankit and myself even started writing this paper. So 2019, Stacy Giroux was in Italy studying olive trees and the Xylella epidemic and what farmers are doing to control that and manage their supply chains. At the same time in 2019, I was in Sicily looking at the Pistacchio Verde di Bronte, the Carota Novella di Ispica, and the Italian trips me up, I'm trying, and the Limone di Siracusa. And so started this project thanks to Dan Knudsen, who's on the call, that pulled me into a project with Carl Ipsen, Jeff Wilson up at IUPUI, and Gianni Patino at the University of Catania, looking at these crops that have a PDO or IGP label, which I'm just going to refer to as a GI protection, a geographical indication. And we went into the field in 2019 wondering if farms that had this type of protection, this GI protection, if they were environmentally sustainable, if the protection was improving farmer livelihoods, if the farms were economically viable. So what were these GI labels doing for farmers and their farm in terms of sustainability, and really in all three pillars of sustainability? So economically, ecologically, and socially, what can these labels do to promote sustainability? Some things that we left the field with were mostly questions about, we found things like specific gender roles in some of these supply chains, women working certain jobs that were paid less than the jobs that were held by males. With the Syracuse lemon, someone was telling us about how the introduction of machinery actually helped to alleviate some of the gender disparities, because now females could work the jobs, they could work the machines that historically relied on more males doing manual labor. We saw some things that were concerning to me, some things we disagreed on whether they were concerning or not, like with the lemons, they were intensifying production to the extent that the trees' lifespan had decreased from over 100 years to 15 years, with the way that they were using rocks to heat the soil to almost, scare the tree into thinking it was dying and producing more fruit. At the same time, we saw with the carrots in Ispica that they were mandating crop rotation for farmers who wanted the label. They had to rotate the crops. They could not get that label every single year. That land had to be planted with something other than the carrots in between. So there were mostly a lot of questions that came up, like these labels seem to, there are some avenues, it seems, where they can promote environmental sustainability. But there are some avenues where it seems like they're actually sustaining more socially inequitable relationships. It seemed kind of all over the place what these GI labels could do. So we had planned to go back to the field in 2020 and further explore these things. And then of course, COVID hit. And Stacy, Kate, and myself were wondering, what can we do from afar? What can we do while we're in quarantine? And our collaborators in Italy are in quarantine. So we hired Ankit from informatics, I believe it was. He's since graduated and moved on, but he built JavaScript, aggregated all of the amendments and the petitions, the registrations that were in the EU database, and wrote a script that would search all those documents for keywords. And we spent months compiling a list of keywords. We worked with Carl Ibsen, who's fluent in Italian and was able to guide us through like how Italians use different languages or different words for different concepts, because often it's not a direct translation from English to Italian in terms of these sustainability concepts we were looking for in the documentation. So we had several iterations of searching these PDFs for different words, finding new words we wanted to search for, finding words we weren't expecting to find, and rerunning the searches. We ended up dividing it into several queries to make it easier for us to interpret the results. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the way that we broke up the queries, and if we're articulating that methodology very clearly. We were still running queries just in the last month, because as we'd find, okay, it's maybe 4 documents bring up workers, go into the document, look at how the word workers is being used. What's the context? What is the role of that word? Is it doing anything to support workers, or is it just referencing them passively? That sort of thing. And in that detailed analysis, we were still last month finding new words we wanted to run more queries on. So that's why, yeah, this is the methods have taken a lot longer than anticipated. And so we really don't have the conclusion drafted out. So apologies if that was disappointing for you to get to the conclusion, and it was just an outline. So I think 3 things that we really found that we're wrestling with how to talk about it, how to interpret it, what to do with it. One is, we found several examples of PDOs or IGP, these GI labels, excuse me, incorporating environmental protections, banning synthetic or chemical inputs, changing methods to, protect workers, the safety of workers in the workplace. They're very few and far between though. It's, just a couple examples really pop up over and over as good examples. There are also some things in there that seem really problematic, like mandating plastic use or single source plastic, which might improve safety for consumers, but might not be environmentally sustainable. So we're seeing all these kind of trade-offs happening in the GI label registrations. Secondly, there's a great limitation with this method, which is we can only get so much context out of the actual registrations and their amendments. At a certain point, we have to go back to the field and see how this is playing out on the ground. So, for instance, the Castagna cuneo, which is a chestnut out of the province of Cuneo, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. They ban synthetic plant healthcare. They basically mandate organic methods. But what does that look like for the workers? We can assume that it improves the safety for workers if they're not exposed to certain chemicals, synthetic chemicals. But how much does that then mandate manual labor that might not be socially sustainable or equitable across gender or race or ethnicity? So there's only so much we can do with this method. And we're hoping that this method takes us in a couple of directions, that we can follow some of these crops along the supply chain and see how sustainability is promoted or not, and what the GI label can do to support sustainability in all the pillars. And then third, one thing that was really interesting was finding the work that the amendments are doing. So something we haven't quite teased out in the results is that some of these documents we're looking at are just registrations to get the IGP or PDO or TSG label. And some of these documents are amendments making various changes, typically to production methods in response to, typically changes to production methods or product characteristics, and typically in response to climate change, economic change, or some kind of agricultural change. So for instance, the word manure was taken out of a GI registration because manure is no longer readily available in the area because of the decline of sheep and goat farms where those producers were sourcing the manure. We see like changes to the product characteristics, having, maybe the product has more iron now or less iron because of changes to the soil or changes to the weather. So it leaves us wondering what the amendments can do, what kind of mechanism this might be to actually make the GI labels more sustainable, to amend them in such a way that they are promoting or mandating more organic methods or socially equitable methods. Really wondering like what the amendments can do and what they also tell us about how sustainable these crops or their production is. Thinking about sustainability in a way that's not necessarily static, but has to evolve and adapt as we become more sustainable, setting those new targets. So I think that's, and then lastly, we really want to get into, what can we learn from this for the US, for other areas around the world. The translation is not necessarily easy, but some examples we think of are hatch chilies out of New Mexico, or Napa Valley wines. What kind of geographic protections could we think about in the US, and what could we do with this sort of mechanism to promote sustainability? So thank you. I hope that gives a little more context. And I'm really excited to hear what you think of the paper.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Angela. And I see we got a couple of questions up. So please forgive me. There's 2 pages of participants on this call. So I'm going to be toggling back and forth. If I miss that you have your hand up or want to make a comment, please do drop something in the chat box and we'll make sure you get recognized and have the opportunity. But Jamie, would you like to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. So I was just kind of reading through your paper as well while you were presenting, Angela, and I think it's really cool what you're doing. I'm always in favor of work in Sicily. I just am a fan of Italy myself, but I'm curious. So reading your paper, there's not this highlight on Sicily that you brought up in your presentation, and so my first thought would be in your paper, if these 3 types of produce are really critical, like if focusing on Sicily is critical to paper, just make sure that that's clear in that work as well. And so and that's what I gathered from your talk. And so my comment is driven by that too. Another question I would have is, in thinking about the economic concerns, are you also considering the political economic situation of Sicily? And here's why that question is so important, because Sicily's history is complicated, right? Sicilians still think of themselves as Sicilians rather than Italians. They also speak Sicilian, which is a language, not a dialect of Italian. And so you've got all these cultural things at play that might really impact the way that food is thought of and the way that food policy is thought of, and even that economic flourishing is thought about as well. Sicily was just impoverished for so many years by the various peoples that conquered it. And so I would just be curious to know, are those, do we see residual effects of that at play now?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I think one thing that we heard when we were there doing field work was that the PDO was really started for the pistachio Verde de Branta. The PDO was really started by political actors in the region and not by the producers. So that is a really important point, that what is the origin of even this type of initiative. And, you know, at least in the Bronte region of Sicily, this had everything to do with political economy in the first instance. It was a way for them to make their, you know, their agricultural economy more viable. And so, and our collaborator there, Gianni Patino, when Stacey and I started out on this research, he was like, you're not going to find anything about social or environmental. It's all economic. That's the point. But we resisted a little bit and said, but what if? Because, you know, there was that little, you know, glimmer of hope with the carrot and the mandating the crop production. And I thought, there's got to be something else going on here. Plus, you know, as I mentioned before, just the way that machinery is implemented and what that does for gender inequity and so forth. I think that these GI labels do more than they were originally intended to do, or they could do more. So yeah, it's been really, I mean, that's especially for Sicily, being such an impoverished nation for so long. This is a really important economic initiative. But interestingly so, at the same time, it's culturally really important for folks. And we see that in just like the prevalence of the festivals or the sagras, and how there's that like interplay between the economics and the social there to support the cultural, at least, with that economic support provided by the GI protection.
Jess, you're up.
Okay, sorry, forgive my, I guess the camera's probably okay. So anyway, thanks for this. Really interesting. I had just a chance to skim the paper. And one question I was thinking about was how you're thinking about the translation of this language into action. So you have this really interesting way of thinking about how to search these texts and what kinds of words you might be looking for that might help us understand how these, I guess they're petitions, right, sort of fit into our notions of sustainability. But given the sort of political salience of these terms, both locally, it sounds, and globally, do you have a sense as to what the next step is in terms of thinking about how whatever you find translates into action? You have this interesting sentence that says, and you know, right before you start, you sort of outline your results, it says how these things could be leveraged to promote or ensure economic, social, environmental sustainability, right? Which suggests to me there is this gap, right, between rhetoric and enforcement and policy. And so I am just curious, you know, how you want to make the leap, or how you want to think about making the leap between sort of rhetoric and this terminology, right, and actual measurable outcomes related to these statements in these documents that you've done all this painstaking work to code. So that's my question, and I apologize if I missed it somewhere in there, but would be curious to sort of hear how you're thinking about that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think really, well, the next step is really finishing going through in detail some of the queries. We haven't quite gotten through the whole economic query, and we might find more terms we want to search for. But I think we've already got a couple examples here that stand out as showing us the potential. And the next step would be to actually get there whenever we can, or at least engage our collaborators that are already in Italy and Sicily, to do the groundwork, looking into what is happening where the rubber meets the road. So when these chemical inputs are banned interviewing the workers about how that changes their methods or their safety, their wages. How does that, play out in terms of manual labor versus mechanized labor? Where are you getting the labor? Where are you getting the actual machinery? Following these supply chains to really see if the rhetoric is actually aligning with the practice on the ground and the experience of the farmers and farm workers on the ground.
If I could just add on, you might consider looking at whether there are any like formalized mechanisms of enforcement, right? So are there in lots of other areas, right, that have sort of government certification, there are sort of monitors, there are individuals and agencies tasked with ensuring that whatever is approved of is actually enforced, right? And so the question is there some version of that, either at the private or the public level, right? Is the government doing that, or is there a private enforcer doing that? Because you might, I think that your interview strategy might be really helpful and interesting, but you also might find that individual experience may or may not reflect a broader sense of enforcement, or even that it may or may not be informed about the level of enforcement of these kinds of things. And so, especially depending on what your sample size is, right? So you might look to triangulate this question of enforcement and monitoring in terms of how these tendencies want to, or how these terms actually translate into outcomes. But that sounds like it's your next project. So
thank you, I appreciate that.
Inza, you're up.
Yeah, thanks. I think I can easily follow up here about your outcomes. I would like to hear a little bit more these outcomes in terms of sustainability. Do you actually want to measure them with proxies or indicators? So, and then all dimensions of sustainability, or, I mean, that could be done for economic part. For the other ones, it's much more tricky to do. Or do you rely on perception, what the farmers think their contribution to sustainability might be? And then do you want to compare your case studies and say, how do they contribute differently to the 3 dimensions of sustainability and why? Or do they all present typical similar cases? Yeah, so a bit more on that, actually the impact you want to measure, if so, how you want to do this. That would be nice to hear a bit more about.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, I think whenever we can kind of pursue multiple methods, like I personally would want to pursue interviews with workers, and not one problem I had in 2019 was talking to a lot of managers, CEOs, but not really getting to talk with the folks that are, throughout the value chain, working in the field or working in the processing facility, rather than owning or managing it. Because I think the stories will change. I think that my co-authors, so I could see several of my co-authors pursuing additional methods, like looking at economic impact, how are profits or sales prices of these goods changing or not, and relative to ones without the GI protections. I'd love to hear if there are other indicators that folks can think of that we might want to keep in our view and pursue analysis of. I'm not sure we have anyone on the team that would that's a soil scientist or really physical physical geographer of sorts, but that might be, I don't know, something that someone would want to add that would not be my area. But I can
Yeah,
see-
I think I could think of there, at least for Europe, there have been 2 huge EU projects over 5-6 years. At least one of them had 36 parties involved, and they were working towards sustainability or social sustainability indicators and how that could be measured. And a huge part of it was based on perception also of the farmers, so that you can go on with your interviews, but maybe follow a few of those ideas. Yeah, I can look it up and then send you a link. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
So a question I have, I'm going to jump in here. It looks like there's space. You mentioned the part about technology adoption with the new machinery and how that's able to alleviate some of the gender differences and pay scale. I know technology is sort of a double-edged sword, because did you run into any cases where the adoption of technology and new machinery is actually causing sort of detrimental impact when it comes to community development? Because a lot of times when we see, the new technology and that technological treadmill be adopted here in the US, you see a decrease in population in rural communities, and therefore sort of a decline in that community aspect. And so I didn't know if that's anything that you came across in your research, that as these markets get developed for economic purposes, you adopt new technology, new machinery, therefore you need less people, and you have these villages that were once agrarian no longer have a need for the population.
That's a great question. Because what we do see a lot is that the GI label is trying to protect the kind of the cultural traditions around these crops. So not just the festivals, but they're, especially with PDO and IGP and that proof of origin. It's like we've been growing this crop forever. Half of the community actually comes to the rural area to harvest during this specific time, and it's the traditional methods that folks use, the manual sort of labor, that these GI labels are trying to protect that. And that, I don't know, that makes me wonder, like, what are they protecting? Is all of that actually sustainable? Or is some of that really protecting some, gendered types of labor that isn't desirable? One thing that we heard several times from folks in 2019, what my goal was, my primary goal was to isolate females and talk to them about gender inequity without the males around, to provide a safe space, make a safe space for us to talk about it. And we heard time and time again that women, agriculture is seen as this male's area, and females aren't really welcomed. They're welcome into certain parts of the production, but definitely not the ones that they desire. And often they're pushed into roles like the accountant or the bookkeeper, or some kind of administrator, when they would actually like to be farming. So I think there's actually, I don't know, there's this tension of like, are these actually not allowing or restricting sort of community development, especially in a gender or feminist sense? But maybe that's not even desirable by some communities. I don't know. That's where we really need to get on the ground and talk to people.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's really interesting. Dan, and then Jamie.
Yeah, I guess one of the things you don't really dwell in the latter part of the paper, but you raise in the first part of the paper, is the suitability of this system for the US. And you talk a little bit about the AVA designations. Can you maybe talk a bit more about the suitability for the US and why or why not this wouldn't fit?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, unfortunately, I am not the one that wrote that part of the paper, so I don't know how well I can speak to it. What we were coming up against was just different frameworks. Like in the US, there's just, it's, trademarks or copyrights, things that aren't necessarily translated into the same framework that we're seeing in the EU. So I think there's a lot more research that we need to do to understand like what that translation to the US would be. Any of my coworkers on the call want to speak to that at all? But yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Jamie.
Yeah, I'm glad that point came up. I thought that the US to Sicily comparison was interesting because their way of protecting things is not like ours. I'm not an IP pro by any means. I'm just gonna leave my comment there. I just know it's different. If I remember right, Italy has more of a history of having patents rather than trademarks so I thought that comparison was interesting for a number of reasons. One, because I don't know, this is one is actually informing a question I have for you, like why are Sicilians still agrarian, especially the areas that you're studying? Like, was it something that kept them agrarian when they would have wanted to choose other options had they had them? I think that's an important piece, because then that leads you to ask questions like, okay, that feeds into the questions that you're already asking, like why are we protecting this? But something that I've noticed, probably other people have as well, like my family's Sicilian, and they left Sicily because 100 years ago it was still agrarian and it was very, very poor. And some of that poverty came from external political taxation from northern Italy. And I'm very curious as to whether that dynamic is still at play 100 years later. But so for that reason, knowing that you take Sicilians who were very poor in Sicily and how they could flourish in the US by being in a different political economic environment, it also makes me wonder do we even want to think about bringing those kinds of protections to the US? So I think that there's this cultural, political, economic element that might really help inform some of the questions you're asking.
Thanks. I really appreciate that comment. That's a critical question we need to ask, is why are Italians, I'm still agrarian, is that even, the desired path, or is this like out of necessity or survival? And
because it's been imposed on them, because it's been imposed by them, right? Imposed upon them in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I mean, like I was just saying, I was hearing from females that they actually wanted to farm, but were kept out of farming. But, where is that, what does that tell us about, more of the history of agrarian livelihoods in Sicily? And if this is even the ideal. I mean, they're competing with, like in Syracuse, they're competing with Spanish lemons. It's a much bigger market, much bigger pull. With the pistachios, they're competing with their own, and it's like, they're trying to stand out, but is it? is it really, is it because it's the only option to make money in that area? Or is there a lot more to it? I think there's a lot more, but it's a good question to ask. So thank you.
Julia.
Hi, Angela and everybody. It was so nice to look over your paper and hear you explain how you all have been developing your work since you went and did that fun field work 2 years ago. I remember you describing the carrot workers in the factory and their uniforms and how they were all women and the work that women could do and the work that men could do. So it's so nice to see this taking shape. And I just had a couple of ideas looking over your paper for a couple of figures or like exercises you could do with figures that might help you develop your presentation. So one idea is in your intro, I was kind of wanting to see a comparison between production under the geographical indication compared to maybe their main competitors, like you just mentioned, like the Spanish lemons or the Persian pistachios, I think you said. Or if there are other producers in adjacent geographic regions that aren't under the geographical designation. Like, I'm just curious, like, what's the price premium that people are earning on their products under the geographic designation? What kind of land base do they need to support themselves compared to people who are producing nuts or fruit or carrots without the geographic designation? So I'm imagining like a table that just shows us a couple of qualities of life with the geographic distinction and life without it and how they compare in terms of the grower's earnings or labor factors or land base or other characteristics. So, so your reader can just see it at a glance and be able to compare in their minds how the GI compares to the other models, either there and other places. And then also it's making me think about a couple of nice papers I've looked at about value chains, which like map out like all the functions of the food supply chain from farm to fork and analyze the value chain all along the way. And I was just looking around for one of those papers to give you and not finding it, so I'll keep looking. But I wondered if working through something like that would be a nice exercise for you all in your discussion or maybe in your results to kind of map out what you're finding like along the value chain in real time. That's a bit of a different approach than the one you've taken so far. So those are just a couple of ideas I had reading your work about just little tables or figures that could clarify what you are building. So thank you.
Thanks, Julia. I love that. I love those ideas. Yeah, there's one thing that immediately comes to mind, which is that I think there seems to be more of a benefit from these labels for processors as opposed to producers. So I'd really like to get to the point where we can kind of map out like who is this economically viable for? Like who is benefiting from this protection along the supply chain? Because what I seem to be hearing or seeing is that like, yeah, in production, especially the farm workers are not necessarily benefiting aside from like maybe guaranteed employment or, but not necessarily in terms of wages or, an increased economic benefit as opposed to the producers who also own a processing firm. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your ideas.
Yeah, you're so welcome. And I think like taking that more of that value chain approach will let you lift up some of the elements that you're really interested in, like gender and labor. But it's so good. So thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Julia. Kurt Waldman.
Hi, I have a couple comments on literature you might be interested in. One is this, so there's a woman named Elizabeth Barham who writes a lot about labels and well, terroir. So she's kind of making this point that a lot of the labeling AOC, DOC in Europe is sort of more geared towards preserving cultural heritage than economic issues. And a big part of that too is that like it's institutionalized differently. So the state is implementing the labels. It's this process of sort of developing the labels, thinking about the production, like all through the production chain, and including environmental issues. Like they'll even get into like what feed to feed animals, etc., in a way that is so antithetical to how we think about labeling in the US. And then there's another guy named Tim Jostling who sort of gets at the second point, and I'm sort of piggybacking off of some comments that were made earlier. So Jostling writes a lot about how, this has been this huge stumbling block in the WTO between US and Europe, trying to figure out how to deal with protected origin labeling, because it's because it's just not how we do it in the US. And we've sort of like fought about how to, how bourbon should be labeled forever, and still it's kind of unresolved. And a lot of that sort of, a more entrenched capitalist system, like, we're thinking in terms of like trademarks and legal issues, and they're thinking about this more as sort of like cultural, et cetera, and preserving heritage. But getting into that kind of like ideological debate about labels could be useful. But I can send you a link to both of those papers I'm thinking about. But they're both not exactly that new. But this is an interesting topic.
Awesome, thanks, Kurt. I appreciate that. I'd love to see those. Yeah, I think there's definitely, like, even with the carrot of Ispica, they said they weren't really making that much more money. They were really just trying to like preserve that culture of producing the carrot, and they just love how the carrot tastes. It's extra sweet because of the salty air and where it's grown, and it's the best carrot in the world. And it's actually like taste actually came up more than anything when we were talking with folks.
And there's so many little labels that you could only be from Italy to even know what they mean. So like clearly they're not trying to use them to project some sort of like market power. Whereas that's exactly what we're trying to do with bourbon. It's like we don't want any other country to produce anything called bourbon, because that's what we export. So it's just a whole different mindset about labeling.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I thought bourbon only came from the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I didn't know it came from any place else. But now we have a question in the chat box. It says, do you imagine a comparison of governance types for each GI could add context to whatever outcomes you find for equity, sustainability, et cetera, from Searles?
Does that mean like type of GI, like the PDO versus the IGP versus the TSG?
How they govern themselves. Each GI, I imagine, has governance, right? And so comparing the governance types to the outcomes, I thought might be interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that'd be super interesting. I know, at least with the 3 crops we were looking at in Sicily, we were trying to figure out what the governance system actually looked like, who was on the board of directors, who's represented in the decision-making space over these large cooperatives, excuse me, or coalitions of producers and processors. So it would be, yeah, it'd be interesting if we could almost come up with an index of sustainability and then chart that out, like in relationship to what the governance systems actually look like. Yeah.
Well, like if they're more commons based, or if they're top down, or it's all the men decide. So when all the men decide, it turns out a certain way, or, you know, what is both the informal and the formal governance of the GI itself? I assume it has some kind of structural, you know, in order to be a GI, you have to, somebody has to give you that certification. So how do they organize that? And then the relationship between how they organize it as to the results around equity and sustainability and all the good stuff.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, when I was talking to a group of women in Ispica, and I asked them about the board, their board of directors was all male, and I asked if that was problematic, and they said, no, the men listen to us, that we tell them what to do. It cracked me up. It was especially strong group of women out of all the groups I talked to. And so, yeah, there's even this nuance between who's actually on the board, but then who are they listening to, who still has like influence over.
Yeah, that's what I mean, formal and informal. It's, to me, it's like the direct, what really happens, more than you're counting all the words in the document. Who reads the document? They're actually just governing among themselves. So it feels to me like that would even be more valuable than what you're doing with the documents.
So winding down here, Salid, you asked a question early before we got started. Do you want to bring that up as to close this out? So not to call you out. Okay, folks. Well, thank you, Angela, very much for sharing this paper. Hopefully, you got some great feedback and some direction on ways to tweak it, ways to go for future research in this area. I know there's a lot of good comments for other resources as well as potential partners that are familiar with the workshop that have been around for a while. So we've got this recorded, and that'll be available if you didn't get those down. I also like to mention. Enza, are you live on here? Enza, do you want to mention anything about the conference?
Yeah, sure. I would like to. So for those of you who haven't seen yet, on the 9th of December, we will have a one-day online conference on food commons. We have very interesting keynote speakers, but we will also have, I hope so, 22 video talks pre-recorded where you can look at, and then the conference is really the idea that we discuss them. And a part of the sessions are also very much overlapping with what we just discussed today, like this labeling and the groups, and if they join up and how they consider food, how they consider their production, if that is supposed to be a commons, or can we conceptualize it not as a commons, and all those issues will be debated. So for some of you, it might be fun to join. So I should maybe put the link in the chat, or James, do you just have it there?
I have it on a different computer, but if you go to the Ocean Workshop.
I could do it while you're talking, I can do it.
Yeah, so if you go to our the Ocean Workshop website, there's information on there. The link will show up here shortly. We just thank you all very much for joining us. Dr. Babb's contact information is on the Sustainable Food Systems website, as well as the one for the Ocean Workshop. So you can follow up with Angela if you're interested. Otherwise, please tune in next Monday, December 6th, for the final fall colloquium. So thank you, everyone. And if you have any questions, stick around.